happened when someone objected at your wedding? Your story. Story 1. I never thought anyone would object at our wedding. We had been together for 5 years and our families were close. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. It was during the ceremony, right before the officiant asked if anyone had any objections. The air felt thick, like something was off, but I brushed it aside. And then, my aunt, whom I hadn't seen in years, stood up. She had been estranged from our side of the family for as long as I could remember, and I had no idea she even knew we were getting married. She walked down the aisle with tears in her eyes, looked straight at my fiancé and said, "You're not right for her." My heart dropped. The officiant tried to calm her down, but she went on about how she thought we were rushing into it and how my fiancé wasn't the right person. It was surreal, but after a few moments, I just started laughing. I told her it was too late for objections. My fiancé looked at me, confused and a little hurt. Thankfully, the ceremony resumed without much more drama, but the tension lingered. Afterward, my aunt apologized, but we didn't have much to say to her. I think it was just a bizarre, emotional moment for her. We ended up having a beautiful wedding reception, but that brief interruption will forever be etched in my mind. It was the one time I truly felt unsure about what was going on, but we pushed through it. Story 2. So, I had a pretty chill wedding. No major stress leading up to it. But on the big day, during the "if anyone objects" part, one of my husband's friends stood up. I'd never met him before, and it wasn't like he was close with the family, but apparently he felt the need to speak up. He started with, "I object," and then went into this long, rambling speech about how my husband and I were making a mistake, how we hadn't been together long enough, and how we didn't know each other well enough. The nerve! I was so shocked I couldn't even respond at first. My fiancé was visibly embarrassed, but also kind of stunned, like he didn't know what to do. The officiant tried to calm him down, but the guy wouldn't stop talking. Finally, my husband looked at him and said, "You have no idea what you're talking about. Sit down and shut up." At that point, the entire room went dead silent. It felt like a lifetime. The guy just stood there for a moment before he muttered, "Sorry," and took a seat. I was ready to walk out right then, but I knew I had to stay strong. After a few seconds of awkward silence, we continued. Honestly, it felt like the entire ceremony had been derailed for a good 10 minutes, but eventually, we got back on track. My husband and I laugh about it now, but that day, I was furious. We never really spoke to that guy again. Sometimes people just don't know when to keep their opinions to themselves. Story 3. I still can't believe what happened at my wedding. My ex-husband's sister, let's call her Amanda, decided to make a dramatic scene during our ceremony. Amanda had always been a bit of a drama queen, but this was next level. My husband and I had been together for a year when we decided to get married, and everything was going smooth. During the "speak now or forever hold your peace" moment, Amanda stood up and started yelling about how my ex and I were meant to be together. She claimed that I was breaking up a family and that my husband wasn't who I really wanted. She went on about how I had always been in love with my ex and that I was making a huge mistake. I had to hold myself together so I wouldn't start crying or scream at her. My husband was livid, and everyone in the audience was just staring, some unsure whether it was a joke or not. Eventually, my ex showed up, uninvited, and tried to calm Amanda down, but he only made it worse. He claimed he still had feelings for me and that we should have never divorced. It was a mess. The officiant tried to move things along, but I had to intervene and ask my ex and his sister to leave, which they finally did, muttering under their breath. We carried on with the ceremony, but there was a definite vibe of awkwardness for the rest of the day. It wasn't the kind of drama I ever expected at my wedding, and while I still talk to my husband about it, I don't speak to Amanda or my ex. It was just one of those moments that will haunt me forever. Story 4. I'll be honest. The thought of someone objecting at my wedding never crossed my mind. Our families got along, and we'd been planning everything for months. It was one of those weddings where you just knew things would go smoothly. But then, during the ceremony, when the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, my best friend, yes, my best friend, stood up and said, "I object." I was so caught off guard that I just stared at her. She went on about how she thought I was rushing into things and that I was too young to get married. She said I hadn't been single long enough after my previous relationship, and that I should take more time to think things through. I couldn't believe it. Everyone else was as shocked as I was. My fiancé's face was completely red, and I could feel his anger rising. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't hold it in. I asked her why she didn't bring this up before, and she said she didn't want to ruin the wedding. To make matters worse, my fiancé stood up and told her that she needed to leave, which was kind of extreme but also kind of amazing. She left in a huff and the ceremony continued, but the damage was done. It was hard to get back into the groove after that. It was the most awkward wedding memory ever, and I don't think I'll ever forgive her for doing that. We're not as close now, and I can't look back on that day without feeling some tension. Story 5. Our wedding had been planned for over a year, and we were so excited. Everything went off without a hitch until we got to the part where the officiant asks if anyone has objections. To our horror, my husband's mother stood up and loudly said, "I object." I thought for sure we had misheard her, but she went on. She said she didn't believe we should get married because she thought her son was too good for me. She said that I was not the one and that she didn't approve of the marriage. It was absolutely mortifying. My husband turned red, and I could see his fists clenching. The officiant, completely caught off guard, tried to calm her down, but she just went on, calling me too independent and that I was too focused on my career. It was like a punch in the stomach, but I just stood there. My husband then stood up, walked over to his mom, and told her to sit down. He was firm but respectful, and in the end, she sat down, embarrassed. We didn't let it ruin the day, but that moment left a huge mark on our relationship with his mother. To this day, we don't talk about it much, but it was the one time I truly felt like everything had been turned upside down. Story 6. My wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and for the most part it was, until a stranger stood up and objected. I'm not exaggerating. He literally stood up in the middle of the ceremony, raised his hand, and said, "I object." The officiant stopped, confused, and everyone turned to see who was causing the disruption. It was a man in a black suit, who I had never seen before. He started off by saying that he had known my husband years ago, and that he wasn't the person I thought he was. My husband and I exchanged confused looks. Was this some kind of joke? But the man went on, claiming that my husband had a secret life, had been married before, and that he hadn't disclosed all his past relationships to me. The nerve of this guy. At first, I thought maybe he was a friend of my husband's from his past. But my husband's face went pale, and I could tell he had no idea who this man was. The officiant asked him to sit down and stop making a scene, but the man kept ranting. He said we'd regret getting married so quickly and tried to give some cryptic advice about not ignoring red flags. The whole room was in chaos at this point. The guests didn't know whether to laugh or intervene. Finally, my husband's best man stood up and said, "Whoever you are, this is not your place. If you don't sit down now, we're calling security." That shut him up. The man hesitated for a moment but realized he wasn't getting the attention he craved and left the venue in a huff. My husband and I were both shaken. After a few minutes of awkward silence, we resumed the ceremony. But honestly, it was hard to shake off that feeling of doubt that had been planted in my mind. Thankfully, the rest of the day went smoothly. But it was a huge relief when we finally left for our honeymoon. We never did find out who that man was, but it was certainly a wedding day we'll never forget. Story 7. My wedding was a dream. We had been planning it for months and everything was falling into place, until my older sister decided to make a scene. To understand why it's such a big deal, you need to know that my sister and I were always incredibly close. That is, until I got engaged. She didn't take the news well, and it only got worse from there. She didn't like my fiancé from the start, and the tension between them was obvious. It was the day of the wedding, and we were in the middle of the ceremony when the officiant reached the part where he asked if anyone had any objections. Without a word, my sister stood up. I wasn't expecting her to say anything at all, so it threw me off when she said, "I object." The officiant paused, and everyone turned to look at her. She went on, saying that I was making a mistake, and that she couldn't let me settle for this guy. I could feel my blood pressure rising as she talked about how I deserved better, how my fiancé wasn't good enough for me, and how she thought I was rushing into this marriage. It felt like a gut punch. At first, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to run up to her and yell, but I knew I couldn't make a scene in front of everyone. My fiancé stood there, silently shaking his head in disbelief. The worst part? The whole thing was totally unprovoked. My sister hadn't raised any concerns about him before this moment. Thankfully, my best friend, who had been standing beside me as a maid of honor, stepped in. She gently but firmly told my sister that this wasn't the time or the place for her opinion, and that if she couldn't be supportive, she should leave. After a long, painful moment of silence, my sister reluctantly sat back down. We got through the ceremony, but the rest of the day was incredibly awkward. We didn't speak much after that, and honestly, things between my sister and I haven't been the same since. I still love her, but I'm hurt by what she did. I never imagined that my own sister would try to sabotage my happiness. Story 8. A few years ago, I had the wedding of my dreams. Everything was perfect, until my grandmother unexpectedly objected. It was during the vows, right after my fiancé and I had exchanged our promises. I was so lost in the moment thinking about how much I loved him that I almost didn't notice when my grandmother stood up. Now, my grandmother was always a bit of a character. She'd had her share of wild opinions over the years, but I never thought she'd disrupt my wedding. But she did. She stood up, cleared her throat, and said, "I object." The officiant, obviously caught off guard, paused and asked her what was going on. What followed was the strangest moment of my life. My grandmother started telling the whole room how my fiance and I were too young to understand what love really is, and that marriage is hard work that we weren't ready for. She didn't just say it quietly, she yelled it. My entire family stared at her in disbelief. At first, I thought maybe she was joking, but she wasn't. My fiance was standing beside me trying to hide the embarrassment on his face, and I could tell he was hurt. I had no idea where this was coming from. My grandmother had never spoken negatively about him before. I stood up and told her that we had made our decision and that we were ready. I said, I love him and I want to spend the rest of my life with him. There was a long silence before she looked at me with a tear in her eye and muttered, I just want what's best. She sat back down and we carried on with the ceremony. It was definitely the most awkward moment of the day, and even though my grandmother and I talked afterward and she apologized, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words had taken something away from the joy I should have been feeling. Story 9. I've always dreamed of a big fairy tale wedding. I wanted everything to be perfect, but I never expected a situation where someone would object. I mean, I was marrying the love of my life. But, of course, life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. It was at the ceremony when the officiant asked, Does anyone object? And my mother stood up. I'm not exaggerating. My mother stood up in front of everyone and said, I object. You're making a mistake. My fiance and I were completely taken aback. She didn't just say it once, either. She went on to say that I was too young to get married and that I shouldn't settle down when I had so much life ahead of me. She even claimed that she didn't think my fiancé was good enough for me. She told everyone that she had never liked him, and it was like a punch to the stomach. I stood there, speechless. I couldn't believe my mother was doing this to me. It was all happening in front of our friends and family. My fiancé was furious, and the tension in the air was suffocating. I couldn't let this continue, so I firmly told my mother to sit down and that she wasn't going to ruin my day. She didn't stop there, though. She stormed out of the church, refusing to be part of the ceremony. We had to finish without her. The rest of the day was incredibly awkward, but we went on with the reception, and somehow it became a story we still tell at family gatherings, albeit with a sense of relief that it was over. My mother and I didn't talk for a few months after that, but eventually she came around. I think she just didn't want to let go of me. Story 10. Our wedding day was nearly ruined by someone I least expected. My father. We were having an intimate ceremony with just close family, and I couldn't have been more excited to marry the man of my dreams. Everything was set, until the moment my dad stood up during the vows. He didn't object in the traditional sense. He didn't say the words, I object. Instead, he stood up and began giving a speech, completely out of nowhere. He said that he didn't think I was ready to get married, that I should have waited longer, and that I hadn't had enough life experiences to settle down. I was completely blindsided. He had never expressed any doubts about my fiancé or our relationship before. I tried to speak up, but he wouldn't stop. It was awkward. It was painful. My fiancé was looking at me, his face a mix of confusion and hurt, and I was in tears by the time my father finished his unsolicited speech. My dad's objections were hard to process, especially in front of all our guests. My mom, standing next to him, was mortified. Eventually, I asked my dad to leave, and after some tense silence, he left the ceremony. The officiant, bless his heart, quickly stepped in and tried to salvage the situation. But it was clear my father's words had taken a toll on both me and my fiancé. Later, my dad apologized, but that day will always stick with me. It was one of the most unexpected and painful moments of my life. Story 11. The day of our wedding arrived, and everything was falling into place, until it wasn't. My soon-to-be husband and I were standing at the altar, our hearts full of excitement, when the officiant reached the infamous line, If anyone objects, speak now or forever hold your peace. That's when it happened. My best friend, the one person I trusted the most, stood up and declared, I object. I was in complete shock, and for a second, I thought I might have heard it wrong. But there she was, standing at the back of the ceremony, staring at me with a mix of anger and pain in her eyes. The room went silent. My fiancé looked at me, his face pale with disbelief. The officiant asked her to speak her piece, and she launched into a tirade about how she was just trying to protect. She said that I was rushing into marriage, that I didn't really know my fiancé as well as I thought, and that I was too young to settle down. I was floored. This was coming from the person who had been with me through everything, my breakup, my struggles, my triumphs, and she was telling me I was making a mistake. I stood there, paralyzed. This was my best friend, the person who had been there for me through thick and thin. Why would she say something like this? The officiant tried to calm her down, but she refused. She said I had to hear the truth, that I deserved someone better than my fiancé, that there was someone out there who could give me more. Finally, my fiancé stood up, his voice shaky but determined. If you really cared about her, you'd let her make her own decisions, he said. That was enough to make her sit down. The tension in the room was unbearable, but the ceremony resumed, albeit with a very different energy. Afterward, I found out that my best friend had been secretly in love with my fiancé for years. She had never confessed, but her jealousy had built up over time. We didn't talk for months, and it's only now, years later, that we've begun to patch things up. But I'll never forget the way my wedding day was nearly hijacked by someone I had trusted the most. Story 12. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had everything planned perfectly. The dress, the flowers, the music, and everything had been going smoothly until the moment the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" My heart skipped a beat as my cousin, who had been quietly sitting in the back of the room, stood up. I knew my cousin had always been a bit of a loose cannon, but I never expected this. She raised her hand and said, "I object." I froze, not sure whether this was some kind of joke or if something really was wrong. But then she continued, accusing my fiancé of being too good for me and claiming that I didn't deserve someone like him. I was in shock, and so was everyone else. My fiancé's face turned bright red, and the rest of the room was completely silent. My cousin went on to say that I hadn't earned the right to marry someone with such high standards. Apparently, I wasn't good enough for the life my fiancé could offer. To make things worse, she said that she had been talking to my fiancé behind my back and knew things about him that I didn't. This was completely untrue. My fiancé had always been upfront with me, and I had no idea what she was talking about. It felt like a public betrayal. Thankfully, the officiant was quick to act and asked my cousin to leave, which she did, grumbling under her breath. The ceremony continued, but the damage had already been done. My fiancé and I exchanged a look, both of us unsure what to make of what had just happened. It wasn't until later that I found out my cousin had been in love with my fiancé for years and had been jealous of our relationship. Despite that bombshell, we managed to salvage the rest of the day, but I'll always remember how one person's jealousy almost ruined everything. Story 13. I never thought anyone would object at my wedding. My fiancé and I had been together for over 5 years, and our families were thrilled for us. But that all changed during the ceremony. It was a beautiful afternoon, and we were surrounded by close friends and family when the officiant asked the famous question, "If anyone objects, speak now or forever hold your peace." Suddenly, my ex-husband stood up. We'd been divorced for 2 years, and he had made it clear that he was over me. So why was he here, ruining what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life? He started by saying that he didn't think I was making the right decision, that I was rushing into something new without fully healing from our past. My fiancé was confused and visibly upset. My ex continued, claiming that he was still in love with me and that I was making a mistake by marrying someone else. The officiant tried to calm him down, but my ex wouldn't stop. It was incredibly awkward. The guests were shifting in their seats, unsure of how to react. I was standing there trying not to cry as my ex made a scene in front of everyone. Finally, my fiancé stood up and said, "Enough." He turned to my ex and told him, in no uncertain terms, to sit down and leave if he wasn't going to respect the ceremony. To everyone's surprise, my ex did just that. He muttered something under his breath and walked out of the church. The ceremony continued, but the energy had shifted. We were both shaken, and I couldn't believe that my ex would do something like that. It took a while to process, but we eventually went on with the wedding, and despite everything, it ended up being a beautiful day. I just wish that moment had never happened. Story 14. I was excited about my wedding day, but I never thought I'd have to deal with something like this. My wedding was supposed to be intimate. Only close family and friends were invited. We were standing at the altar saying our vows when the officiant asked, "If anyone objects," that's when my brother stood up. Now, my brother and I had always been close, but in recent months, things had become a bit strained between us. He had been very vocal about not liking my fiancé, but I never expected him to cause a scene on my wedding day. He said, "I object," and I felt my heart sink. My fiancé was already nervous, and now this? My brother went on to claim that my fiancé wasn't good enough and that I was settling for someone who didn't share the same values. He said that my fiancé was too focused on his career and didn't understand the importance of family. I tried to stay calm, but I was livid. I looked at my fiancé, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. He had been nothing but supportive, and for my brother to say those things in front of everyone, it felt like a slap in the face. The officiant tried to intervene, but my brother wasn't having it. Finally, my father stood up and told my brother to leave. My father was usually a calm man, but I had never seen him so angry. My brother stormed out of the church and the ceremony continued, but the tension was thick. We finished the ceremony, but the rest of the day was incredibly awkward. My brother didn't come back to the reception, and I haven't spoken to him since. I was devastated, but I still married the love of my life. Story 15. It was our second wedding attempt. We had originally gotten engaged 2 years ago, but due to personal reasons, we had to call off the wedding. Now, here we were, doing it again, and I was determined that nothing would ruin it. Everything was going great. until the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" Suddenly, my future mother-in-law stood up. I was stunned. She'd been nothing but kind to me up until this point. She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and disappointment and said, "I object." At first, I thought maybe she was joking, but she wasn't. She started talking about how she didn't think we were ready, how my fiancé wasn't prepared for the responsibilities of marriage, and how he still had unresolved issues with his ex. It was like a punch to the gut. She went on to say that she didn't want me to be another one of his failed relationships. I was floored. We had talked about everything, and I had no idea she felt this way. My fiancé was in shock, and I could tell it was hurting him deeply. My father-in-law, who had been silent up until that point, stood up and told his wife to sit down and be quiet. He said, "This is not the place for your issues. Let them have their day." She reluctantly sat down and the ceremony continued, but it felt like everything had shifted. We finished the ceremony, but I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Afterward, we spoke to my mother, and while she apologized, I knew the relationship would never be the same. It was one of those moments where you realize that not everyone has the same vision of your happiness. Story 16. Our wedding day was everything I had dreamed of, until it wasn't. We were standing in front of our friends and family exchanging vows when the officiant asked the infamous question, "Does anyone object?" At that moment, I felt a lump form in my throat. And then, my sister stood up. Let me backtrack a bit. My sister and I had never been close. We had a rough childhood, and I always felt like she resented me for some reason, but she had promised to be supportive of my wedding. So, when she stood up, I didn't know what to think. I figured it was just her way of causing drama. But this was different. She said, "I object." Everyone was silent, waiting for her to continue. She went on about how she thought I was rushing into marriage and that I didn't know enough about my fiancé's true nature. Apparently, she thought I was too naive to see the red flags. She told me I was settling and should have taken more time to figure things out. The worst part? She mentioned something that only she and I knew about my fiancé's past. Something that he had been open about, but that no one else. My fiancé's face drained of color, and I could see his heartbreak. I felt sick to my stomach. Why was she doing this? What had changed in the last few months? I stood up and said, "You've had plenty of time to voice concerns before, and you know better than to do this now. Please sit down." To my surprise, she did. She didn't apologize, but she didn't make a bigger scene either. The ceremony continued, but the energy was completely different. I couldn't focus on my vows anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about the hurt my sister had caused. After the ceremony, I confronted her. She apologized, but it didn't feel sincere. I realized that no matter how much time passed, she would always be jealous of my relationship. We haven't spoken much since. Story 17. I didn't think I'd have to deal with an objection at my wedding. I had spent so much time making sure everything was perfect. We had a small ceremony with just close family and friends, and it was going beautiful. That was until my father stood up. Now, my father and I had always had a strained relationship, but I thought that would be behind us by the time I was getting married. I was wrong. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, my father stood up, cleared his throat, and loudly said, "I object." The officiant paused, unsure of how to proceed. My fiancé and I looked at each other in shock. My father had always been a bit old-fashioned, but this was something else entirely. He then proceeded to explain that he didn't approve of my fiancé because he was too different from the family. He claimed that my fiancé wasn't worthy of me, and that he wasn't someone who would provide the life that I deserved. My heart dropped. My fiancé's face was a mix of disbelief and hurt. My father continued, saying I should reconsider my decision. He told me that he had always known this wasn't right. I didn't know what to say. In that moment, I was furious, heartbroken, and confused all at once. My fiancé stood up, his voice shaky but firm. "With all due respect, I love your daughter, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life with her, whether you approve or not." It took everything I had not to break down crying. After what felt like an eternity, my father sat down, but the damage had been done. The ceremony continued, but it wasn't the same. I ended up calling my father after the ceremony and demanded an apology. He never really gave me one, but we eventually talked things through. It took time, but our relationship has never fully recovered. That moment has stayed with me, and I'll always wonder why my dad chose to sabotage my wedding day. Story 18. I never expected anything to go wrong at my wedding. We had been planning it for months, and everything was falling into place. Our friends and family were all there, and my fiancé and I were standing at the altar when the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" And then, my best friend stood up. At first, I thought it was some sort of joke. I was stunned. My best friend had been by my side through thick and thin, and I couldn't understand why she would do this now. She said, "I object." The room fell silent. My fiancé looked at me, bewildered, and I stood there, frozen. My best friend, a woman who had always supported me, suddenly looked like a stranger as she began explaining that she didn't think I was ready to get married. She said I hadn't found myself yet, and that I was making a decision based on emotion rather than reason. She said that marriage was a huge commitment, and I hadn't spent enough time living for myself before jumping into it. To make matters worse, she turned to my fiancé and said that he wasn't the right person, that I was too young and too immature to understand the weight of what I was about to do. I was in shock. I never thought she would have these feelings, and certainly not at the most important moment of my life. My fiancé stood up and told her that this wasn't the place for her concerns, and that we were both making the right decision. He asked her to sit down. It took a while for the tension to ease, but we managed to continue with the ceremony. Afterward, I tried to talk to my best friend. She explained that she was scared for me and thought I was rushing into things, but it didn't make it any easier. We haven't spoken much since, and it's hard for me to look back on that day without feeling betrayed by the one person I thought would always have my back. Story 19. It was the day of our wedding, and everything was perfect. We had carefully chosen every detail of the day, from the venue to the music to the guest list. The ceremony was beautiful, and we were just about to say our vows when the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" And then, my ex-fiancé stood up. Yes, you read that right, my ex. We had broken up over a year before, and I thought everything was behind us. Apparently, it wasn't. He stood up in the middle of the ceremony, looking disheveled and out of place. He said, "I object." I was completely shocked. What was he doing here? Why was he causing this scene? He continued, claiming that he was still in love with me and that I was making a mistake by marrying someone else. He said we had unfinished business and that I should reconsider my decision. My fiancé, who had been so calm up until that point, was now visibly angry. He stood up and told my ex to leave, but my ex wouldn't budge. I felt the tension in the air as the room waited for the next move. Finally, I told my ex that we had both moved on and that I was getting married. I asked him to leave, and with one last look of frustration, he stormed out of the venue. The ceremony resumed, but it felt strange. My fiancé and I exchanged vows, but the shadow of my ex lingered over us. Later, I found out that my ex had been dealing with some personal issues and had a hard time letting go of our past, but that didn't excuse his behavior on my wedding day. Story 20. We had been planning our wedding for months, and it was shaping up to be the perfect day. The venue was beautiful, the flowers were gorgeous, and our families were excited. The ceremony was going smoothly until my mother stood up. My mother had been difficult during the planning process, but I didn't expect her to object during the ceremony. When the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, she stood up, glaring at. She didn't say anything at first, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, she said, "I object." The room fell into complete silence. She started explaining that I was making a huge mistake, that I didn't know what I was getting into. She said that I wasn't thinking clearly, and that my fiancé and I weren't right for each other. She even went so far as to say that I was too young to make such a big decision. I was shocked and furious. Why was she doing this? Why now? The officiant tried to intervene, but my mother just kept going. At this point, I was fighting to hold back tears. I had no idea where all of this was coming from. My fiancé finally spoke up. "This is our day, and we've made our decision," he said. "If you can't respect that, then you need to leave." My mother sat down, and we proceeded with the ceremony, but the damage had already been done. Afterward, I tried to talk to my mom, but she was adamant that I was making the wrong choice. Our relationship has never been the same since, and even though we've tried to rebuild, that moment still lingers in my mind. Story 21. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but everything changed the moment the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" I was standing there in front of all our friends and family, my heart racing as I glanced at my fiancé, ready to say our vows. And then, my childhood friend Lisa stood up. I never thought Lisa would be the one to cause a scene, but there she was, shaking with what seemed like emotion. Her hand raised as she said, "I object." My fiancé and I both froze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Lisa had been my best friend for years, and we had been through everything together. She wasn't supposed to be the one to ruin my wedding day. The officiant paused, clearly as confused as the rest of us. Lisa wasn't exactly known for being quiet or reserved, but this was a different level. She began by saying that she didn't approve of my fiancé. Her voice quivered with what seemed like anger as she explained that I was rushing into this marriage and that I had no idea what I was getting myself into. She claimed that I didn't know enough about him and that she had seen things that made her believe I was settling. My fiancé was stunned, his face pale, and I could feel his heart breaking with every word she said. The crowd was so silent you could hear a pin drop. At that moment, it felt like I was in a fog. This wasn't happening. Lisa couldn't be serious. She wasn't one to meddle in my relationships before, so why now? Finally, I stood up and said, Lisa, I don't know where this is coming from, but we've talked about this a million times. Please sit down, and let's finish this. She hesitated for a moment, but eventually sat back down, her face filled with disappointment. The ceremony continued, but the mood was completely different. I couldn't stop thinking about her words. Afterward, Lisa apologized, but it didn't feel right. Our friendship has never been the same, and I still can't understand why she chose that moment to speak up. To this day, I sometimes wonder if there was something deeper going on that I'll never fully understand. Story 22. We were only halfway through our wedding ceremony when it happened. Everything had been so perfect up until that point. My fiancé looked stunning, the weather was beautiful, and our guests were all smiles. But when the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" I never expected to hear those words from the person who stood up. My mother. She didn't just object quietly. No, she stood up, waving her arms around, shouting, "I object. My daughter is making a huge mistake." The room fell into an eerie silence. I couldn't believe what was happening. My fiancé looked at me with a mix of confusion and hurt. My mother was never the type to create drama, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. She went on to say that I was too young to get married and that I was making a rash decision. She said that I hadn't had enough time to experience life and that I shouldn't settle down so quick. The worst part? She claimed my fiancé wasn't good enough for me. That's when I lost it. I stood up and told her in front of everyone, "You don't get to make that decision for me. I'm an adult, and I'm making this choice." I could see my fiancé's jaw tightening, but he didn't interrupt. My mother looked at me like I had just betrayed her, but eventually she sat down. The officiant awkwardly tried to regain control of the situation, but the damage had been done. We continued with the ceremony, but everything felt off. It was hard to shake off the sting of my mother's words. After the ceremony, I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. It took months before we had a real conversation about what had happened, and even then, she never truly apologized. It wasn't until I became a mother myself that I began to understand some of her fears, but I'll never forget that moment, when my wedding was nearly hijacked by the one person I thought would support me most. Story 23. It was supposed to be a beautiful day. Sunny skies, flowers everywhere, and our closest friends and family gathered to witness us exchange vows. My fiancé and I had been together for 7 years, and everyone knew how much we loved each other. But as the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" everything came to a screeching halt. My older brother Ethan stood up. At first, I thought he was just going to make a joke or say something lighthearted, but then he said, "I object." I was speechless, staring at him as he went on to explain why he thought I was making a mistake. Ethan told the whole room that he didn't approve of my fiancé, saying that he didn't think he was serious enough about the relationship and that I was settling for someone who didn't really know what he wanted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My fiancé stood there, looking like he was about to explode. I could tell he was holding back tears. Ethan's objections weren't entirely based on facts. They were rooted in his own frustrations and fears. He had always been overprotective of me, and for some reason he thought my fiancé wasn't the right person for me. He had no real reason for his objections other than that he didn't want to let go of his little sister. I finally found my voice. "Ethan, you're my brother, and I love you, but this is my decision. If you can't respect that, then I need you to leave." There was a long, painful silence before he sat back down, his face red with emotion. We finished the ceremony, but my brother didn't speak to me for weeks. We eventually worked through it, but it was hard to let go of the hurt. I realized that some people can't handle change, and in my case, it was my brother who couldn't accept that I was moving on to a new chapter in my life. Story 24. Our wedding day had been planned meticulously. Every detail was thought through, and the excitement in the air was palpable. But just as we were about to exchange our vows, the officiant asked the one question that sent everything spiraling. "Does anyone object?" To my horror, my aunt, who had always been somewhat distant, stood up. I hadn't seen her in years, and I didn't even know she was attending the wedding. She was the last person I expected to speak up, but there she was, looking at my fiancé with a sad, almost pitying expression. And then she said, "I object." She didn't stop there. She proceeded to say that she didn't think I should be getting married so young, and that I was rushing into something I wouldn't fully understand. She claimed I didn't know what love was and that I hadn't experienced enough life to make such a big commitment. I was devastated. I had always tried to stay close to my aunt, and now here she was, tearing down the one decision I was sure about. My fiancé looked at me with wide eyes, unsure of how to handle it. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath. Without thinking, I stood up and said, "This is my life, and I've made my decision. If you can't support it, I ask you to leave." It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I couldn't let my aunt make me doubt everything I had worked so hard for. She didn't leave, but she apologized later, explaining that she had been projecting her own fears about love onto me. We didn't talk much after that, and I don't think our relationship was ever the same. But I'm glad I stood up for myself. Story 25. The wedding was going smoothly, and I was so excited to marry the love of my life. The ceremony was beautiful, the weather was perfect, and we were surrounded by our closest loved ones. But then, the officiant asked the dreaded question, "Does anyone object?" And then, my fiancé's ex-fiancé stood up. I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't know she was even invited. She looked calm, but I could see the tension in her face. She raised her hand and said, "I object." The room went silent. My fiancé's ex had been a part of his life before me, and they had broken up amicably, so I didn't think she would still have feelings. She said that my fiancé was rushing into this relationship, and that she thought I deserved someone who was truly ready for commitment. She claimed that he wasn't over their past, which seemed to come out of nowhere. My fiancé's face was a mixture of confusion and frustration. I was in shock too. The officiant asked her to explain herself further, and she said that she had come to terms with their breakup. But now, seeing him move on so quickly, she was worried that he wasn't ready to marry anyone. I was speechless. How could she do this on our day? Finally, my fiancé stood up and told her to sit down, saying, "I'm not going back to the past. I'm here with the woman I love and we're moving forward together." She didn't say anything else but quietly sat down, and we continued with the ceremony. It wasn't the wedding I had imagined, but we made it through. Afterward, my fiancé and I had a long conversation about what had happened. And while he apologized for her actions, it didn't change the fact that it was an awkward moment we'll never forget. Story 26. I thought nothing could possibly ruin our wedding day. My fiancé and I had been together for 5 years and everything was going according to plan. Our ceremony was beautiful. The guests were all smiling and the weather was perfect. We had decided on a small, intimate ceremony, which made it even more special. That was until my uncle stood up. I had always known my uncle to be a bit eccentric, but I never imagined he would do something like this. He was seated in the back, and just as the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" my uncle stood up, raising his hand. The room fell silent. My fiancé turned to look at me, unsure of what was happening. The officiant, somewhat taken aback, asked him to speak. Without any hesitation, my uncle declared, "I object." The room was in complete shock. My uncle continued to say that he didn't think my fiancé was good enough for me. He said that he didn't approve of the way he treated me and claimed that I was rushing into this too quickly. I was absolutely stunned. My fiancé's face turned pale and I could tell he was hurt. My family, who had all been so supportive up until now, was now awkwardly shifting in their seats, unsure of how to react. I took a deep breath and stood up facing my uncle. "With all due respect, Uncle Tom, this is my decision. If you can't respect that, then I ask you to leave." My voice wavered, but I knew I had to stand my ground. My uncle looked at me for a long moment, and then, surprisingly, he sat down, grumbling under his breath. We continued with the ceremony, but the mood was definitely off. Later, I found out that my uncle had always been overprotective of me, especially since my parents had passed away. He wasn't ready to let go of the role he had played in my life. While it didn't justify his actions, I understood where he was coming from. The rest of the day went relatively smoothly, but I'll never forget the moment when my uncle tried to hijack my wedding. I haven't spoken to him much since that day, but I still love him. It was just a bizarre experience that I don't think I'll ever fully shake off. Story 27. Our wedding was supposed to be a simple, beautiful affair, but we never expected to face a challenge like this. We had been together for 7 years, and all of our friends and family were there, supporting us. The ceremony was going smoothly, and then the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" To my absolute shock, my ex-husband stood up. We had been divorced for almost 5 years, and I thought we were on good terms, but that all changed the moment he said, "I object." I couldn't believe my ears. I thought surely he must be joking, but he wasn't. He stood up and told everyone that he didn't think I was making the right decision. He claimed that I hadn't fully healed from our marriage and that I was rushing into another relationship. He even went as far as saying that my fiancé wasn't the right person for me and that I was making the same mistakes again. My fiancé was visibly upset, and I could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. I wanted to scream at my ex to sit down, but I was too stunned to react. It felt like time had stopped. The officiant tried to calm him down, but my ex was relentless. Finally, I stood up and looked my ex directly in the eye. "This is my life and I've made my choice. I'm marrying the man I love, and you need to respect that." There was a long pause before my ex reluctantly sat down. I turned to my fiancé, who had tears in his eyes, and we continued with the ceremony. The rest of the day was a blur. Afterward, I had a long talk with my ex. He said he still had unresolved feelings and wasn't ready to let go of the past. It wasn't easy to hear, but I had to be firm. I love my fiancé, and nothing was going to change that. Still, I'll always remember how my wedding day was almost ruined by my ex's unresolved emotions. Story 28. Our wedding day was a dream come true. We had a small ceremony on a beach, surrounded by close family and friends, and everything was perfect. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during the vows. As the officiant asked, "Does anyone object?" there was an awkward silence. That's when my mother-in-law stood up. Now, I've always had a strained relationship with my mother-in-law. She never really approved of me, but I was determined to have a peaceful wedding day. Apparently, that wasn't meant to be. She raised her hand and said, "I object." I froze. I had no idea what to expect, but the words that came next hit me like a punch in the stomach. She said that she didn't approve of our marriage because I wasn't good enough for her son. She claimed that I didn't come from the right background and that our relationship was destined to fail. My fiancé's face turned bright red, and he looked like he wanted to run out of the room. I could see the hurt in his eyes, and that's when I snapped out of my shock. I stood up and said, "With all due respect, I love your son, and we're making this decision together. If you can't support that, then I ask you to leave." My fiancé, who had been silently furious, stood up beside me and added, "This isn't your day. Please respect our decision." To my surprise, my mother-in-law didn't argue. She sat down, visibly upset but unwilling to continue the confrontation. The ceremony proceeded, but the mood was definitely strained. I tried to hold it together, but I was devastated by what had just happened. Afterward, I had a conversation with my mother-in-law, but she never apologized. It's been years now, and while my fiancé and I are happily married, our relationship with his mother has never fully recovered. It was the hardest part of our wedding, and it's something I'll never forget.